Okay, now that we've established the very real issue of teacher burnout, let's start digging into the nuts and bolts of effective grading. Remember, the goal of this program is to decrease teacher burnout while also helping students grow. So this episode is going to focus on the characteristics of effective feedback for students. In other words, what qualities does feedback need to have in order for it to work? In one particular study conducted by Grant Wiggins, he asserts that to serve learning, feedback must meet 4 criteria. It must be timely, specific, understandable to the receiver, and formed to allow for self-adjustment on the student's part. Liz created an acronym to better help us understand these 4 criteria. STEP, S, specific, T, timely, E, easily understood, and P, personal responsibility. Our goal throughout this series is to help you step out of teacher burnout and step into grading freedom. Let's start with S, specific. I want to start this section by admitting that I'm an unashamed grammar nerd. One of my favorite classes in college was English Grammar and Usage, where we spent the entire semester diagramming paragraph-long sentences. I love grammar and I love editing. I always have. I used to hand out candy to any of my students who caught a grammar error in a textbook. It always made me so proud when one of my middle schoolers would notice a comma splice. It also kills me a little bit that our acronyms don't entirely adhere to parallel structure. I know, some of you grammar nerds already notice, but just work with us. Because of my love for grammar, during my student teaching, I enjoyed marking all of the mistakes students made in their essays. Again, I'm a little sadistic when it comes to grammar and marking up papers. But as the semester went on, I realized a few things. First, it was time-consuming. It took me a significant amount of time to mark every mistake students made in their papers, and after the first round or 2 of essays, I began to tire of this time-consuming task. The second thing I realized was that my students didn't learn from my feedback. If I corrected 10 comma errors in a paper, the students didn't learn why those were errors or how to fix them. And guess what? They made the same exact mistakes in the next paper, and I marked up the same errors again with no changes. What was my problem? Well, there were many, but a central issue in my grading was that I wasn't being specific enough. I was marking students on every mistake they made, from grammar to organization to analysis to spelling. Put yourself in the student's shoes. If they look at their paper and only see marks of every single thing they did wrong, does it incentivize them to improve? Does it give them a starting point of where they can even begin to improve? Or instead, does it cause them to shut down because how could they possibly fix all of these errors? My favorite high school teacher had one of those grading charts where each symbol connected to an aspect of the paper that was incorrect. In theory, this saved her time because she was only marking symbols instead of writing complete sentences or paragraphs explaining what the students could fix. But I still remember sitting in my seat and receiving those papers back. I rarely ever looked up the chart to see what I was doing wrong. I wasn't sure how to fix it, and I sure as heck wasn't going to connect each symbol to the category of what I did wrong. And while I certainly wasn't a star student, I did grow up to become an English teacher, and I did care about my education and my grades. I just didn't have specific enough feedback to know how to best improve. My teacher's intentions were solid. Again, she was my favorite teacher. But did her feedback help me learn and grow in the best possible way? Not exactly. This is why the first aspect of effective feedback is that it needs to be specific. Pick a couple skills that you want to focus on and only provide feedback for those skills. Resist the urge to mark up everything else wrong with the paper. It is possible, trust me. I had to practice because there's a part of me inside that wants to still fix everything. But if you practice only looking for 1 or 2 specific aspects of a paper, you can read and grade writing so much more quickly while also providing students with something specific and focused for them to fix. In a later episode, I'm going to discuss how to take these aspects of grading and apply them in the classroom. It's so important for students to know what aspects of your paper you're assessing and why. But I will get there. Let's move on to the next aspect of effective feedback. T, timely. When assigning writing, feedback is often given days, if not weeks, after the assignment was written. When I was first hired at the high school where I spent the majority of my career, a veteran teacher told me that he always gave himself 2 weekends to grade essays. Most teachers in the department nodded their agreement. This was a perfectly reasonable amount of time to expect a teacher to grade hundreds of essays. I set this as my internal clock as well. 2 weekends allotted to grading these essays and getting them in the gradebook. As I became a more seasoned teacher, though, and as I began to have kids of my own, I realized that even 2 weekends can be an incredibly difficult turnaround. Many teachers I know who are well-respected, well-loved, and wonderful educators spend months grading papers. With the amount of writing to grade and the amount of students we have, I completely understand. However, what's the problem here? If it takes teachers weeks to read and grade essays, by the time they give their feedback to their students, they've moved on to something else in the curriculum. Oftentimes, students don't even remember what the essay was about. I would be guilty of passing back papers and not even going over the feedback or having students do anything with the feedback because we had already moved on to something else and I didn't want to backtrack. Or, as most teachers understand, I would feel so pressed for time to get through all of the content that I didn't allocate enough time to actually go over the feedback, especially when it was given weeks or more later. As Wiggins states in the study mentioned previously, providing feedback to students is a critically important step in the learning process, and yet, in many classrooms, feedback occurs only at the end of assignments, almost serving as a post-mortem and justifying a student's final grade. Ouch. I'm guilty. All right, let's talk sports for a minute. I've played or coached soccer my entire life. I've had many games come down to penalty kicks over the years, so I always made it a point to practice them. Could you imagine if, as a coach, I saw one of my players continue to kick the ball over the net, but I decided to wait for a few weeks to give her actionable steps with how to improve? No way! I'd let her know right away how to adjust her body or her mindset when she's kicking, and then I'd give her opportunities to fix her form and to try again. We expect timely feedback and pointers in our sports with an opportunity to make those adjustments immediately. That's how athletes improve. They're given timely feedback that they can apply immediately. Why is it different from writing? Okay, well, obviously, there are a lot of differences. Reading an essay takes longer than watching someone shoot a penalty kick. Yes, that's true. But we are here to prove to you that providing feedback for writing can happen quickly. And then students can use that feedback right away to improve their writing skills, just like you'd expect your player to do on the field. It's just a matter of knowing how to set up your writing process to support the research of what works, which is the entire purpose behind the grading method. How much more could our students understand, and how much stronger could their writing be if we provided specific and timely feedback? I'm going to resist the urge to start giving pointers right now on how to achieve this in our classrooms because, again, that's in an episode to come. For now, the third characteristic of effective feedback is E for easy to understand. Another common issue teachers have is making sure the feedback is understandable. Remember the chart my favorite English teacher used? Having to look up a chart that corresponded with the symbols she used as feedback was difficult for her students to track. My first few years of teaching, before I discovered the glorious feedback within Turnitin.com, more of that to come, all of my feedback was written on my students' papers. The problem? My handwriting. This is a very literal interpretation of easy to understand, but it truly was an issue for my students those first few years. They'd come up to my desk and say, hey, what did you say here? Because they couldn't understand my writing. They didn't know what I was saying. Then, of course, there's the deeper interpretation of easy to understand, which is the content of our feedback itself. If I write on my students' paper, thesis must be more specific. Many students have no idea how to interpret this or how to fix their thesis statement. If I wrote, you need to deepen your analysis, they wouldn't understand how to do it. My feedback was easy to read when I typed it, but difficult to actually understand or accomplish because I didn't always provide actionable steps. These were statements I wrote to make myself feel like I was giving effective feedback, or, like Wiggins said, to serve as a post-mortem in justifying a student's grade. But in reality, most of my students didn't know how to fix these issues in their writing. When I look back on a lot of the feedback I provided, it wasn't easy to understand or apply, especially if I didn't address it or explain it in class, and if I didn't allow students a chance to revise, which leads us to our final and arguably most important aspect of feedback. P, personal responsibility, or, as Wiggins says, allowing for self-adjustment on the student's part. in easier terms, revisions. Well, duh, revisions. We all do this, right? Or at least we all know it's important. However, I was often guilty of not allowing enough time for true revisions. Or I would give it as an option, but not make it a requirement. Or, like I said earlier, I'd give the feedback and already have moved on to another part of the curriculum, and not wanting to backtrack, I wouldn't even go over the feedback or allow any revisions. I know it's hard to admit, but it's true. My entire perspective on revisions changed during my research process, especially after reading about one particular study. Neil Cowie's paper is aptly titled, "Students of Process Writing Need Appropriate and Timely Feedback on Their Work and, in addition, training in dealing with that feedback." Pretty straightforward, right? In his study, however, he found something that was, for me, groundbreaking. He claims that after an experiment with different types of feedback, his students who received comments on both grammar and content improved their writings, but so did the students who received zero feedback. This led Cowie to the assertion that feedback is important, but ultimately the act of a student revising his or her paper in a timely manner is even more important. In Cowie's words, this could suggest that it is the act of rewriting itself, which is just as important, if not more important, than any kind of teacher intervention. Let me repeat that so it sinks in. This could suggest that it is the act of rewriting itself, which is just as important, if not more important, than any kind of teacher intervention. Simply allowing a student to revise his or her paper has the potential to lead to more improvement than any amount of feedback we provide. Reading this made me kick myself for all of the lost opportunities in my classroom. But here we are, it's not too late. One more note about personal responsibility. In the coming episodes, Liz and I are going to talk in depth about metacognition and its role in the feedback and learning process. I cannot overstate how important it is for students to own their learning, to reflect on their learning, and to be in control of their learning. Giving students a chance to take personal responsibility is crucial in helping them succeed and grow, while also taking some of the workload and time pressure off of the teacher's plate. In the next 2 episodes, Liz is going to discuss her research on the importance of rubrics and the benefits of introducing student-designed rubrics in the classroom. The rest of the episodes following will explain in further depth how to expand upon and utilize these 4 qualities of effective feedback in your classroom. See you soon.